One morning in late April, Thomas woke up with an idea. He called Sophie before he could talk himself out of it. "I want to visit Elena's grave today," he said. "And I want you to come with me, if you're comfortable with that." There was a pause on the other end. Then Sophie said, "I'd be honored, really." They met at the cemetery around noon. It was a beautiful day, warm with a light breeze that made the new leaves dance on the trees. Thomas hadn't been to Elena's grave in over a year. He'd stopped coming, because it felt like visiting a stone instead of visiting her. But today felt different. Today felt right. Elena's headstone was simple gray granite with her name, the dates of her birth and death, and a small carved rose at the bottom. Thomas had chosen the rose specifically because of her favorite saying. Sophie hung back a little, giving him space. Thomas knelt down and cleared away some dead leaves that had accumulated over the winter. "Hi, Elena," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I haven't been by in a while. I'm doing okay, though. Better than okay, actually." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I brought someone to meet you. Her name is Sophie, and she's the reason I'm better. Or maybe you're the reason. I'm still not totally sure how this all works." Sophie stepped closer, kneeling beside Thomas. She touched the locket around her neck, the same gesture Thomas had seen her make hundreds of times now. "Your locket has been taking care of me," Sophie said to the headstone. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I wanted to thank you for lending it to me, for sending Thomas when I needed him, for teaching him how to help someone through grief." She took a shaky breath. "My dad died 5 years ago, and I've been stuck ever since. But knowing your story, seeing how Thomas survived losing you, it gave me hope that I could survive too." Thomas reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand. They sat there in comfortable silence for a few minutes, just being present. "I've been thinking about the locket," Sophie finally said, "and I think I should give it back to you now." Thomas shook his head. "I've been thinking about it too, and I think you should keep it, but not as a loan, as a gift. From Elena to you." "Thomas, I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "That locket saved you in ways you might not even realize. It gave you comfort when you needed it, and then it brought us together so we could help each other. That's what Elena would have wanted. She always believed in paying kindness forward." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. But I have one condition." "What's that?" "I want you to add something to it. Put a picture of your dad in there with Elena. Let them watch over you together." Sophie let out a sob and hugged Thomas tightly. "Thank you. Thank you so much." They stayed at the cemetery for another hour, talking to Elena as if she were right there with them. Thomas told her about his volunteer work, about the people he'd taught, about how helping others had given him purpose again. Sophie told her about going back to school, about her dreams of teaching elementary kids, about how the crash had woken her up to her own life. As they were getting ready to leave, Thomas noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The rosebush planted near Elena's grave, which had been dead and dry for as long as he could remember, had new growth. Fresh green stems pushed up. From the base and at the end of one stem was a single red rosebud, just beginning to open. "Look at that," Sophie whispered, seeing it too. Thomas stared at the rose, remembering Elena's words. The rose will bloom again. She'd said it so many times during her illness. It was her way of saying that life continues, that beauty returns, that hope persists even in the darkest times. "She's telling you it's okay," Sophie said softly. "To bloom again. To live again." Thomas felt something release in his chest, something he'd been holding on to without even realizing it. Permission. He'd been waiting for permission to move forward, to be happy again, to embrace this new chapter of his life, and here it was in the form of a blooming rose next to his wife's grave. He knelt down one more time and touched the headstone. "Thank you, Elena, for everything, for loving me, for teaching me, for sending Sophie into my life, for showing me that love doesn't end, it just changes form." His voice broke. "I'll always love you, but I'm ready to live again now." Really live, not just exist. As they walked back to their cars, Sophie asked, "What happens now?" Thomas thought about it. "Now we keep going. You finish school and become the amazing teacher I know you'll be. I keep volunteering and helping people. We stay friends. We honor the people we've lost by actually living." "I like that plan," Sophie said. They'd reached their cars, parked side by side. Before getting in, Sophie pulled out her phone. "Can we take a picture? I want to remember this day." They stood together with Elena's grave visible in the background, arms around each other's shoulders, and Sophie snapped a selfie. In the photo, they're both smiling real smiles, the kind that reach the eyes. And there, visible on Sophie's neck, in the sunlight, was the golden locket with its engraved rose. Over the next few months, they settled into a comfortable rhythm. Every Tuesday evening, they'd meet for coffee at the Daily Grind. It had become their tradition, a way to check in with each other, to make sure they were both still moving forward instead of backward. Sophie showed him her acceptance letter for student teaching. Thomas showed her the thank you card from a woman who'd used his training to help someone having a heart attack. They celebrated each other's victories and supported each other through the hard days. Sophie eventually started dating someone she met in her teaching program, a kind guy named Daniel who made her laugh. Thomas was genuinely happy for her. She deserved happiness, deserved love, deserved everything good. Thomas wasn't ready for that yet. Maybe wouldn't be for a long time. But he'd stopped feeling like his life was over. He'd stopped just going through motions and started actually living. He'd joined a hiking group and climbed his first mountain. He'd reconnected with old friends he'd been avoiding. He'd even adopted a dog, a goofy golden retriever who needed rescuing just as much as Thomas had needed someone to care for. 1 year after the crash, they returned to Elena's grave together. It had become their anniversary of sorts, a day to remember how their lives had intersected in the most impossible way. The rose bush was now full and healthy, covered in blooms. "She was right," Thomas said, looking at all those red roses. "The rose really did bloom again." Sophie touched the locket, a gesture that had become second nature to her. She'd added a photo of her father like Thomas had suggested, and now both, their lost loved ones, resided in that small golden heart. "Do you think she planned all of this?" Sophie asked. "Your wife? Do you think she somehow orchestrated everything so that we'd meet?" Thomas had thought about this question many times over the past year. He'd gone back and forth between logical explanations and magical thinking. But standing there at Elena's grave, looking at those impossible roses, feeling the warmth of Sophie's friendship beside him, he finally had his answer. "I think love is more powerful than we understand," he said. "I think Elena loved me so much that somehow, some way her love persisted after death. Maybe it guided that locket to Sophie. Maybe it put me on that road at exactly the right time. Maybe it brought us together because we both needed someone who understood loss." He paused. "Or maybe it was all just incredible coincidence. But you know what? It doesn't really matter which it was. What matters is that we're both here. We're both healing and we're both actually living our lives again." Sophie nodded. "To Elena," she said, raising an imaginary glass. "To Elena," Thomas echoed, "and to impossible roses." They stood there for a while longer, two people connected by tragedy and fate and a small golden locket with an engraved rose. Two people who'd learned that love never really ends, it just changes form. Two people who'd been given a second chance at life and were determined not to waste it. As they walked back to their cars, Thomas felt lighter than he had in years. The grief wasn't gone, would probably never be completely gone, but it no longer defined him. He was more than a widower. He was a volunteer, a friend, a person with purpose and hope and reasons to get up in the morning. Sophie glanced over at him and smiled. "Same time next week? Coffee and probably too much conversation about my lesson planning?" "Wouldn't miss it," Thomas said, and he meant it, because Elena had been right all along. The rose had bloomed again, not in the way Thomas had expected, not in the way he'd planned, but in exactly the way he'd needed. Life had continued. Beauty had returned. Hope had persisted. And somewhere, Thomas liked to think Elena was smiling, happy that the love she'd left behind had transformed into something new and beautiful. Happy that her locket had completed its impossible journey. Happy that the man she'd loved had found his way back to living. The rose had bloomed again, and this time, Thomas was ready to appreciate every single petal. The locket had somehow fallen off or gotten tangled in the linens. "Is there any way we could contact this Patricia Hughes?" Sophie asked gently. "It's important. This locket belonged to his wife." She gestured to Thomas. "She passed away 3 years ago in Sacred Heart Hospital, and the locket went missing. We're just trying to understand what happened." Dorothy's expression shifted to one of sympathy and concern. "Oh my. Well, I'm not really supposed to give out donor information, but given the circumstances..." She wrote down a phone number on a piece of paper. "Patricia comes in here sometimes to volunteer. She's a kind woman. I'm sure she'd want to help if she could." Thomas took the paper with a hand that shook slightly. "Thank you. Really, thank you so much." Outside the shop, Sophie looked at him. "Do you want me there when you call her?" Thomas thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I do." They went back to the same coffee shop where they'd met the day before. It was becoming their place somehow. Thomas ordered coffee he didn't drink and stared at the phone number on the paper for a full 5 minutes before finally pulling out his cell phone. Sophie reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Whatever happened, it wasn't intentional. Remember that?" Thomas nodded and dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Hello? Hi, is this Patricia Hughes?" Thomas asked, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, who's calling?" Thomas took a breath. "My name is Thomas Chen. You don't know me, but about 8 months ago you donated some of your mother's belongings to Sacred Heart Charity Shop. One of those items was a gold locket with an engraved rose. That locket belonged to my late wife, and I'm trying to find out how your mother came to have it." There was silence on the other end. Then, "Oh no, please tell me this isn't what I think it is." "I'm not calling to cause trouble," Thomas said quickly. "I just need to understand what happened. My wife died 3 years ago at Sacred Heart Hospital, and the locket disappeared that night." Patricia's voice came back shaky. "Can we meet in person? I'd rather explain this face to face. I work near downtown. There's a park on Maple Street with benches near the fountain. Could you meet me there in an hour?" Thomas agreed, and they hung up. He looked at Sophie. "She knows something." "Then let's go find out what," Sophie said. An hour later, they sat on a park bench watching children play on the swings while they waited. A woman in her 50s approached, looking nervous. She had kind eyes but worry lines around her mouth. "Thomas Chen?" she asked. "That's me. This is Sophie." They shook hands, and Patricia sat down beside them. "I'm so sorry," Patricia began immediately. "When I found that locket in my mother's jewelry box, I had no idea where it came from. I just thought it was hers. If I'd known..." "Please," Thomas interrupted gently. "Just tell me what happened. How did your mother get the locket?" Patricia's hands twisted in her lap. "My mother worked in the hospital laundry for 43 years. She loved that job, loved feeling useful. But in her last few years, she developed dementia. She started bringing things home. Small things mostly. Buttons, coins, sometimes pens. We thought it was harmless." Thomas's chest tightened. He could see where this was going. "After she died and I was going through her things, I found a small box hidden in her closet," Patricia continued. "It had maybe 20 or 30 items in it, things she'd collected over the years. The locket was one of them. I never connected it to the hospital. I just thought she'd bought it somewhere and forgotten. So when I was donating her belongings, I included it." "Did she ever say anything about the locket?" Sophie asked. "Anything at all?" Patricia's eyes brightened slightly, as if remembering something. "Actually, yes. I found a note in the box in her handwriting. It was shaky, written near the end. It said something like, 'The lady who lost this was at peace. She kept saying the rose will bloom again.'" Thomas's world stopped. Those words. "The rose will bloom again." That was Elena's phrase. Her mantra. She'd said it constantly during her illness, trying to stay positive, trying to give him hope. "She said that?" Thomas's voice barely worked. "Those exact words?" "Yes, I still have the note at home. I kept it because it seemed important somehow, even though I didn't understand it." Patricia looked at Thomas with tears in her eyes. "Your wife said that?" "All the time," Thomas whispered. It was her favorite saying. Patricia covered her mouth with her hand. My mother must have been there when she passed. She must have found the locket in the sheets or somewhere nearby, and because of the dementia, instead of turning it in, she took it home. She was crying now. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. My mother was a good woman. She would never have intentionally. I know, Thomas said, and he meant it. He wasn't angry. How could he be angry at a sick woman who'd probably had no idea what she was doing? I know she didn't mean any harm. But she remembered what your wife said, Sophie added softly. Even with dementia, she remembered those words. That's beautiful, actually. Your wife's words stayed with her. Patricia nodded, wiping her eyes. Mom always remembered the strangest things. Faces, words, moments. Even when she forgot my name sometimes, she'd remember something someone said to her 30 years ago. They sat together for a while, 3 people connected by a twist of fate and a piece of jewelry. Patricia promised to send Thomas the note his mother had written. Thomas assured her again that he held no ill will toward her or her mother's memory. As they were leaving, Patricia stopped them. Can I ask you something? How did you even find the locket? Sacred Heart Charity Shop gets hundreds of donations. What made you look there? Sophie and Thomas exchanged glances. Then Sophie told the story of the taxi crash, the fire, the rescue. She explained how Thomas had pulled her from the burning car and then saw the locket around her neck. Patricia listened with wide eyes. When Sophie finished, the older woman shook her head in wonder. So let me get this straight. You bought the locket 8 months ago. You were wearing it when your taxi crashed. And the man who saved your life happened to be the husband of the woman who originally owned it. She looked between them. That's not coincidence. That's something else entirely. Thomas had been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to say it out loud. It sounded too impossible. Too much like something from a movie. But hearing Patricia say it made it real. My mother used to say that objects hold energy, Patricia continued. That they carry the love and intention of their owners. Maybe that locket was trying to find its way back. And maybe your wife knew you'd need to save Sophie. Maybe she made sure you'd be there. Thomas didn't know if he believed that, but he couldn't deny the impossible chain of events. Elena's locket, lost for 3 years, ending up around the neck of someone who would need rescuing at exactly the moment Thomas would be driving by. The odds were astronomical. As they walked back to their cars, Sophie asked, Do you believe it? That Elena somehow orchestrated all of this. Thomas looked up at the sky, at the clouds moving slowly across the blue. I don't know what I believe, but I know Elena would have loved this story. She always said everything happens for a reason. He smiled sadly. Maybe she's still teaching me that lesson. 6 months had passed since the night of the crash. Spring had arrived in full force, transforming the city from the dead browns and grays of winter into vibrant greens and bursting colors. Thomas noticed these things now in a way he hadn't for years. The world had stopped being just a backdrop to his grief. It was becoming real again, alive again. Sophie had been accepted into the teaching program at the community college. She'd started classes in January and was absolutely thriving. Thomas had never seen someone so excited about homework. She'd call him after her child psychology class or her teaching methods seminar, talking a mile a minute about everything she was learning. Did you know that children's brains are literally different from adult brains? She'd asked him one evening while they walked through the park. Like they process information in completely different ways. It's fascinating, Thomas smiled. You're going to be amazing at this. I hope you know that. I'm terrified, Sophie admitted, but it's a good kind of terrified. The kind that means I actually care about something again. Thomas understood that feeling. He'd started volunteering with a local emergency response training program, teaching community members how to respond to accidents and emergencies. After pulling Sophie from that burning taxi, he'd realized he had skills that could help others. His construction background meant he was good in crisis situations, good at staying calm when everything was chaos. His first class had been nerve-wracking. Standing in front of 15 people, trying to teach them about fire safety and emergency response, he'd felt like an imposter. But then he'd told them about Sophie's crash, about making the split-second decision to run toward danger instead of away from it, and something had clicked. The students leaned in, asked questions, wanted to know more. By the end of the class, 3 people had told him he'd inspired them. You're a natural teacher, Sophie had said when he told her about it. Elena would be proud. The mention of Elena no longer hurt quite as sharply. Thomas had learned to carry her memory differently, like Sophie had suggested months ago. She was still with him, but the grief had transformed into something gentler. something that coexisted with happiness instead of crushing it. To explain? That would go over well. The bell above the door chimed and Sophie walked in. She looked better than she had last night, that was for sure. She'd changed into jeans and a sweater, and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. And yes, she was still wearing the locket. Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Hey," Sophie said, sliding into the seat across from him. "I hope you haven't been waiting long." "Just got here myself," Thomas lied. He'd actually been there for 20 minutes, too anxious to arrive late. They ordered coffee, made small talk about how they were both feeling after last night's ordeal. Sophie mentioned she'd barely slept, kept seeing the fire every time she closed her eyes. Thomas understood that feeling. He'd had plenty of sleepless nights over the past 3 years, though for different reasons. "I still can't believe what you did," Sophie said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. "The way you just ran toward that burning car. Most people would have stayed back, waited for the fire department," Thomas shrugged. "Wasn't really thinking, just reacting." "Well, your reaction saved my life." Sophie took a sip of her coffee, then looked at him with curious eyes. "Can I ask you something? Last night after you pulled me out, you looked at me like you'd seen something shocking. And I don't mean the fire. It was before the big flames, right after we sat down. What was it?" This was it. The opening he'd been both hoping for and dreading. Thomas took a breath. "That locket you're wearing," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can I ask where you got it?" Sophie's hand immediately went to her neck, fingers touching the golden heart. It's kind of a strange story, actually. I found it at a thrift store about 8 months ago." "Why do you ask?" Thomas pulled out his phone with hands that weren't quite steady. He'd spent an hour that morning looking through old photos, finding the perfect one. He turned the screen toward Sophie. The image showed a woman with kind eyes and dark curly hair, laughing at something off camera. She was wearing a blue sundress, and around her neck hung a heart-shaped locket with an engraved rose. "That's my wife, Elena," Thomas said quietly. "She wore that locket every day. I gave it to her for our 5th anniversary. When she died 3 years ago in the hospital, the locket went missing. I looked everywhere for it, filed reports, asked everyone. It just disappeared." Sophie had gone pale. She stared at the photo, then at the locket around her own neck, then back at the photo. This is the same locket?" "Look at the bottom edge," Thomas said. "There's a small dent." Elena dropped it once in a parking lot. With trembling fingers, Sophie lifted the locket and examined it. There, barely visible, was the small imperfection. Her eyes widened. "Oh my God. Which thrift store did you buy it from?" Thomas asked. "Sacred Heart Charity Shop. It's downtown over on Cedar Avenue. They get a lot of their donations from—" Sophie paused, her face showing realization. "They get donations from the hospital. I remember the clerk telling me that when I bought it. Sacred Heart Hospital donates items that get left behind or taken by accident," Thomas finished. His mind was racing. Someone at the hospital must have picked up Elena's locket. Maybe without even realizing it was from a patient. Maybe it got mixed in with laundry or medical supplies, and eventually whoever took it must have donated it to the charity shop, never knowing its significance. "I need to take this off right now," Sophie said, already reaching for the clasp. "This belongs to you. I'm so sorry, I had no idea." "Wait," Thomas said, surprising himself. "Don't. Not yet." Sophie froze, her hands still at the back of her neck. "What?" Thomas wasn't sure why he'd stopped her. All he knew was that seeing the locket again, after 3 years of thinking it was gone forever, felt like a message. And the fact that it was around the neck of the woman whose life he'd just saved? That couldn't be random chance. "Elena believed in fate," Thomas said slowly. "She always said things happened for a reason, even the hard things. I never really bought into all that. But this," he gestured between them, between the locket, the impossible coincidence. "What are the odds? Out of everyone in this city who could have bought that locket, it was you. And out of all the nights I could have driven home, I was there exactly when your taxi crashed. I was right there." Sophie's eyes were filling with tears. "You think she— What led you to me?" "I don't know what I think," Thomas admitted. "But I know Elena would have wanted someone to have the locket. Someone who would appreciate it. And maybe—" He trailed off, not sure how to finish that thought. "Maybe we're supposed to find out why this happened," Sophie said softly. Together, Thomas nodded. That felt right somehow. Over the next hour, they talked more. Sophie explained that she'd been drawn to the locket the moment she saw it in the thrift store. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt like it was calling to me, she said. I'd been having a really hard time. Anxiety attacks, trouble sleeping. My therapist said it was delayed grief over losing my dad. When I saw the locket, I needed it. Did it help? Thomas asked. Sophie touched the locket again. Actually, yeah. Whenever I'd start to panic, I'd hold on to this and somehow I'd feel calmer, like someone was watching over me. She laughed sadly. Now I know someone was, your wife. Thomas told her more about Elena. How they'd met in college, both waiting in the same endless line at the registrar's office. How she'd made him laugh within 5 minutes of meeting her. How she'd fought cancer with incredible strength and grace, more worried about him than herself even at the end. She sounds amazing, Sophie said. She was. They decided together to visit Sacred Heart Charity Shop to see if they could trace back exactly how the locket had ended up there. It was a long shot, but they both needed to understand the full story. Sophie offered to return the locket right then, but again, Thomas found himself refusing. Keep it for now, he said. I think maybe you were meant to have it. At least for a while. Until we figure out what this all means. As they left the coffee shop, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. Not happiness exactly, but something close. A sense of purpose, maybe. Or possibility. Elena had always told him that life would surprise him again when he was ready. That the rose would bloom again. That was her favorite saying. The rose will bloom again. It was about renewal. About hope after loss. Looking at Sophie wearing Elena's locket, walking beside him toward the parking lot, Thomas wondered if maybe his wife had been right all along. Maybe this was his second chance to really live again. Not to forget Elena, but to honor her by staying open to whatever came next. Same time tomorrow? Sophie asked. We could visit the thrift shop. Same time tomorrow. Thomas agreed. And for the first time in 3 years, he was actually looking forward to tomorrow. The Sacred Heart Charity Shop sat between a nail salon and a Chinese restaurant on Cedar Avenue. Thomas had probably driven past it 100 times without ever really noticing it. The windows displayed donated clothes on mannequins, books stacked in neat piles, and various household items with handwritten price tags. Thursday afternoon, Thomas and Sophie walked through the door together. A bell jingled overhead and the smell of old books and lavender air freshener filled the air. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a bun and glasses hanging on a chain around her neck. She looked up from the mystery novel she was reading and smiled warmly. Good afternoon, she said. Can I help you find something? Sophie stepped forward, her hand unconsciously moving to the locket around her neck. Actually, we were hoping you might remember this. She lifted the locket so the light caught it. I bought it here about 8 months ago. We're trying to find out where it came from. The woman stood up, moving around the counter to get a better look. Her eyes lit up with recognition. Oh yes, I remember that piece. Beautiful craftsmanship. You don't see work like that very often anymore. She studied it more closely. It came from a hospital donation, if I recall correctly. Do you keep records? Thomas asked, speaking up for the first time. Of who donates items? We do, actually. The hospital sends over boxes of things periodically, but individual donors we track separately. She moved back behind the counter and started pulling out a large binder. Let me see. You said 8 months ago. Around February, Sophie confirmed. The woman, whose name tag read Dorothy, flipped through pages of handwritten logs. Her finger traced down columns of dates and names. Here we are. February 14th, Valentine's Day. I remember because I thought it was fitting, a heart locket coming in on Valentine's Day. She looked up at them. It was donated by a woman named Patricia Hughes. She was cleaning out her late mother's belongings. Thomas felt his heart skip. Her late mother. Do you know anything else? Did she work at the hospital? Dorothy adjusted her glasses and read further. According to the notes here, she mentioned her mother had worked in the hospital laundry department for over 40 years. Retired about 5 years ago, passed away about 2 years back. The laundry department. Thomas's mind raced. Elena had been in the hospital for 3 weeks before she died. Sheets, gowns, blankets, all of that would have gone through the laundry. If Thomas Chen had been taking the same road home for 3 years now. Every evening after finishing his shift at the construction site, he'd drive down Riverside Avenue, past the old grocery store, through the traffic light at Oak Street, and finally pull into his driveway around 6:30. It was routine. It was predictable. And honestly, that's exactly how he liked it these days. 3 years ago, his life had been turned upside down when his wife Elena lost her battle with cancer. Since then, Thomas had found comfort in routines. Wake up at 5, work until 5, drive home, eat dinner, watch some television, sleep, repeat. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was manageable. It kept him moving forward when some days all he wanted to do was stop. This particular Tuesday evening in October, the weather wasn't cooperating with anyone's plans. Rain had been falling steadily since noon, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the glow of streetlights and neon signs. Thomas had his windshield wipers on full speed, and even then, visibility was poor. He was driving carefully, both hands on the wheel, staying well under the speed limit. As he approached the intersection where Oak Street crossed Riverside, he noticed a yellow taxi ahead of him. The driver seemed to be going a bit too fast for the conditions. Thomas eased off his gas pedal, creating more distance between their vehicles. Something in his gut told him to be cautious. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but to Thomas, it felt like slow motion. The taxi hit a patch of standing water near the intersection. The vehicle hydroplaned, the driver losing complete control. Thomas watched in horror as the taxi spun once, twice, then slammed sideways into a metal light pole with a sickening crunch. Sparks exploded from somewhere under the taxi's hood. Thomas's heart jumped into his throat. He immediately pulled his truck to the side of the road, his hands already reaching for the door handle before he'd even fully stopped. Other cars were slowing down, but no one else was getting out yet. The front of the taxi was crumpled like an accordion. Through the rain-streaked windows, Thomas could see movement inside. Someone was still in there, and then he saw it. A flicker of orange light from under the hood. Then another. Within seconds, flames were spreading across the front of the vehicle, fed by leaking fuel and damaged electrical systems. Thomas ran. He didn't think about his own safety. He didn't think about the risk. He just ran toward that burning car as fast as his legs would carry him. The rain soaked through his work jacket within seconds, and his boots splashed through puddles, but none of that mattered. The taxi driver had managed to get his door open and was stumbling out of the front seat, clearly dazed. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. "There's someone in the back," the driver shouted, his voice panicked. "I can't get the door open from this side." Thomas rushed to the rear passenger door. Through the window, he could see a woman slumped against the opposite door. She was moving, trying to sit up, but she looked disoriented. Her hands fumbled with the seatbelt, unable to get it to release. The flames at the front of the car were growing larger, hungrier. Black smoke was starting to fill the interior. He yanked on the door handle. It didn't budge. The impact had warped the frame, jamming the door shut. Thomas pulled harder, putting his full weight and strength into it. His construction work had made him strong, and he used every bit of that strength now. The metal groaned in protest. "Come on, come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, pulling with everything he had. Behind him, he could hear someone yelling that the fire department was on the way, but there wasn't time to wait. Those flames would reach the gas tank any minute. With one final, desperate pull, something gave way. The door flew open so suddenly that Thomas nearly fell backward. He caught himself and immediately reached inside for the woman. She was coughing now, the smoke making it hard to breathe. Her seatbelt was still stuck. "Hold still," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice calm, even though his heart was racing. He found the release button and pressed it hard, jiggling it at the same time. Finally, it clicked and the belt retracted. "I've got you. Come on, we need to move now." The woman's eyes met his, and he could see the fear there, but also trust. She reached for his outstretched hands. Thomas grabbed her under her arms and pulled, helping her slide across the seat and out of the car. Her legs were shaky, barely able to support her weight. He half carried, half dragged her away from the burning taxi. They'd only made it about 15 feet when there was a loud whooshing sound. The flames had found something flammable, and the entire front half of the taxi was suddenly engulfed in fire. The heat hit them like a wave, even from where they stood. Thomas pulled the woman further back, and they both collapsed onto the wet pavement near the sidewalk. For a moment, they just sat there, both breathing hard, both soaking wet from the rain, both trying to process what had just happened. Thomas could hear sirens in the distance, getting closer. The taxi driver was sitting on the curb nearby, holding his head. Other people had gotten out of their cars now and were gathering at a safe distance, some with their phones out, probably calling for help or recording the scene. "Are you okay?" Thomas finally managed to ask the woman beside him. "Are you hurt anywhere?" She coughed a few more times, then shook her head. I don't think so. Just shaken up." Her voice was hoarse from the smoke. "You saved my life. That fire, if you hadn't—" "Don't think about that," Thomas interrupted gently. "You're safe now. That's what matters." The woman nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. She was shivering, though whether from cold, shock, or both, Thomas couldn't tell. He started to take off his jacket to give to her, and that's when he saw it. Even in the chaos, even with the rain falling and the fire burning and the sirens wailing, Thomas's eyes locked onto something that made his blood run cold. Around the woman's neck hung a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a heart-shaped locket. But it wasn't just any locket. Thomas would have recognized it anywhere. The heart was about the size of a quarter, with an intricate rose engraved on its surface. The petals were detailed, carefully crafted. On the side of the heart was a tiny clasp, and if you knew where to look, you could see a small dent near the bottom edge where it had been dropped once. Thomas knew all of this because he had given that exact locket to his wife Elena on their 5th wedding anniversary. She had worn it every single day for the next 10 years, right up until the day she died in the hospital. And when the nurses had given him back her personal belongings, the locket had been missing. He'd searched everywhere for it. He'd asked everyone at the hospital. He'd filed reports. But it had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. Yet here it was, hanging around the neck of a complete stranger whose life he'd just saved. Thomas felt like he couldn't breathe, and it had nothing to do with the smoke. His hands started shaking. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible, but there was no mistaking that locket. He'd held it too many times, watched Elena touch it too many times to be wrong about this. "Sir?" The woman was looking at him with concern. "Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas couldn't find words. All he could do was stare at that locket, gleaming in the firelight, as paramedics arrived on the scene and the world continued moving around them. But for Thomas, time had stopped. Because somehow, impossibly, he'd just found a piece of his dead wife on a stranger he'd pulled from a burning car. The paramedics had insisted on checking both of them. The woman, whose name Thomas learned was Sophie Brennan, had some minor bruising from the seatbelt and a bit of smoke inhalation, but otherwise she was incredibly lucky. The taxi driver had a concussion and needed stitches, but he'd be fine too. Thomas himself had escaped with nothing but some scrapes on his hands from wrestling with that jammed car door. While the EMTs worked, Thomas couldn't stop glancing at that locket around Sophie's neck. She'd caught him staring a few times, probably thinking he was just in shock from everything that had happened. And maybe he was. But it wasn't the burning car that had him rattled. It was that impossible piece of gold hanging from a chain. After the police had taken their statements and the fire department had put out what remained of the taxi, Sophie had approached Thomas. Her dark hair was still damp, plastered to her face, and she'd wrapped herself in a blanket the paramedics had given her. "I don't even know your name," she'd said, her voice still rough. "You pulled me out of that car and I don't know your name." "Thomas," he'd replied. "Thomas Chen." "Well, Thomas Chen, I owe you everything. My parents. They already lost my dad 5 years ago. If I died tonight..." Her voice had cracked. "Can I at least buy you coffee or something? Tomorrow, maybe? I need to properly thank you." Thomas had almost said no. He wasn't looking for gratitude or recognition, but that locket. He needed to know about that locket. So he'd agreed, and they'd exchanged phone numbers before Sophie's sister had arrived to take her home. Now it was Wednesday afternoon, and Thomas sat in a small coffee shop called the Daily Grind, watching the door and trying to figure out how to ask a stranger about a piece of jewelry without sounding completely insane. What was he supposed to say? "Hi, that necklace you're wearing belonged to my dead wife, C.